Hey guys, welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. In this lecture, we're going to cover Keynesian macroeconomics. So if you remember what we've done so far in this class, we did the foundations, then we did the measurement. We are now firmly onto models. We started with that first model of the early growth model, the first attempt that economists made to really model the whole macroeconomy. Now we're going to turn our attention to probably the first uniquely macroeconomic model, and this was done by an economist named John Maynard Keynes, hence Keynesian macroeconomics. And what really spurred Keynes was the Great Depression. So the problem with the Great Depression is, if you remember, the early growth model assumes that all markets clear, right? That prices are flexible, wages are flexible, interest rates are flexible, all those move around and all those markets clear, right? We get the right amount of goods and services supplied and the right amount of goods and services demanded, and those two are in equilibrium. Well, along comes something like the Great Depression, and all of a sudden that isn't true anymore. And so we see that there must be something more added to the model, because our model that we've had to this point, which taught us a very important lesson, remember that wealth is driven by productivity, right? But it's not a complete model. Okay, so Keynes wanted to address this, right? And there's this problem in the early growth model that it omits government, right? So there's no government in the early growth model, and Keynes said, well, there's this role for stabilization for the government to play. Okay, so Keynes moves economics out of the classical framework, out of the early growth model, and he focuses on the economy as a whole. Remember, the early growth model breaks the economy down into 3 different markets, right? The Keynesian model then can be used to analyze short-term fluctuations, or what we'd call business cycles. I've got a great podcast with an economist named Robert Murphy that goes over the different models for understanding business cycles. I'll put that up in this section so that you guys can check that out if you're interested in that. We've covered business cycles here, but the early growth model essentially says there's no business cycles. We just clear all the time, right? So Keynes starts with one very important assumption. He says if consumers demand a given level of output, it will be provided by businesses. Okay? As a consequence, Keynes believes that consumer spending is the key to explaining how the economy reaches short-run equilibrium, that balance that we're always in an early growth model. How do we get there in the Keynesian model? Well, it's this consumer spending that's driving the economy. Okay, so what's equilibrium? That's when we have full employment, that's when we have stable output, and that's when we have this level of income. So remember, in the early growth model, we're thinking about prices. So in the Keynesian model, we're thinking about employment, output, and income. Okay, the key to understand, and the thing about the Keynesian model, as we'll discuss later on in this lecture, is the Keynesian model is not a panacea. It doesn't solve everything. It's not somehow a perfect model. But it does something important. In the same way that early growth is not a perfect model, but it teaches us something very important about productivity. The Keynesian model is imperfect, and we're going to move away from that when we get on to the current model that economists use. And there are other models in between. I'm just picking the really highlight, the early growth and the Keynesian models are the big time, most important models. It teaches us something about modeling an economy while in a depression or a severe recession. Okay, so a couple of things are true when we're in a depression, when we're in a recession. There's significant slack in the economy, right? And so we have this situation where it's not like what the early growth model says. We actually do have high unemployment. We actually do have resources sitting around not being used, right? And so there's something missing there in the early growth model. This is what we call excess capacity. In the early growth model, we learned production can only be increased with increased productivity. If we have excess capacity, that's no longer true. Production can actually be increased without raising prices, because we can tap into resources and individuals who are not working, unemployed people. We can tap into those, and we can increase the production that's happening in our economy through a method other than increasing productivity. Okay, so the Keynesian model starts with that basic GDP idea, but it says our aggregate expenditure, so aggregate expenditure is AE. We're going to use that a lot, so remember that. Our aggregate expenditure is going to be balanced out with production. Okay, so notice that this right here, what I'm saying, gross domestic product equal to aggregate expenditure, is another way to say this assumption here. If consumers demand a given level of output, that's aggregate expenditure, it'll be provided by businesses. That's GDP. Okay, so that's what Keynes said. He said, look, here's this aggregate expenditure that we need to level out with GDP. Okay, so therefore, short-run equilibrium is as simple as when GDP is equal to aggregate expenditure. We also know that GDP is equal to all of these things that we've seen before, right? So we've already gone over that. If you need to refresh yourself on that, go back to that video really quickly. Come back. Consumption, investment, government spending, exports, imports. We discussed about why that's important. Now, as an empirical observation, consumption is 70% of GDP. That's what Keynes was looking at when he said consumer spending is what drives short-run equilibrium. This empirical observation that consumption is 70% of GDP. Okay, so let's take a look at Keynes's model, because before, right, we had prices and quantity, and that's what's balancing in our economy. Keynes says no, it's consumption and it's income, and income's sort of the real kicker here. And I'm going to get into that in a second, but let's look at this really basic Keynesian model, okay? What happens if we graph consumption versus income? Well, we have this one obvious important line in the model, and that is a 45-degree, a 1-to-1 ratio line. Along that line, consumption is equal to income. Consumption is equal to income. So what happens if we're here at what we'll call point A? We're at point A right here. Point A, we see that consumption 1 is equal to income 1. So in this case, we'll say that's like, looks like we're saying that's $100. Okay? What happened there? Well, consumption is exactly equal to income, so savings is 0, there's no debt, right? What happens if we're over here at what we'll call point B? And in consumption is 90 when income is 120. Well, in this case, income is greater than consumption, so there must be saving. How much? You can immediately see that it must be a saving of 120 minus 90 is 30, so we save $30. What happens if instead we're at this point C? If we're at point C right here. Well, now we have 90 in income and we're back to $100 in spending. That means we actually have $10 shortfall in our budget because of our expenditure, and we might make that up in debt, right? So this is kind of the foundation. This is the kind of the foundation of the Keynesian model, this consumption versus income graph. It's the same way that we were doing markets, and those markets had price and quantity, or interest rate and savings and investment, or wages and hours worked. Now Keynes is saying actually what's driving the economy is consumption and income, and there's some intuitive appeal to that. But what's important is we understand that this is what we're just talking about is disposable income. So the income that you have after taxation so that you can spend it. We talked about this earlier in the class. Okay, so point 1, this is just a recap of what I did about, I call them A, B, and C. They're 1, 2, 3 here, right? So you can see at 1, at A, that we spent everything, we saved nothing, i.e. consumption equal to income. At point 2, we see that income is greater than consumption. That's B right here. So savings has to be greater than 0. And at 3, or point C, we see that consumption is greater than income, and so therefore savings has to be negative. Okay, so before we get on to the full Keynesian model, we want to understand a couple of ideas that really drive consumption in the Keynesian model. And this is called propensity to consume. Okay, so what's the average propensity to consume? Propensity, if you remember, is just like a drive to a likelihood of a particular thing, right? And so your average propensity to consume is just your total percentage of income consumed. So it's consumption divided by income, right? What's more important is an idea that we call marginal propensity to consume. Remember, we've met that idea before here in the class. Marginal is the next unit, okay? So given a change in income, what is our change in consumption, okay? So this is key because it fits with Keynes's idea that consumption rises with income, but by less than the full amount of the income. So as we make more, we don't always spend the full amount more, right? That's what we mean by the marginal, meaning the next unit. Another way to say this, marginal propensity to consume is the change in consumption given change in income. Okay, the key here, consumption is driven by income. Consumption is driven by income. The corollary to that is therefore obviously savings must also be driven by income. In the early growth model, we said consumption is driven by the price. Consumption is driven by the price, okay? So Keynes comes along and says, well, actually, we can learn a bunch more things then, because now we can think about what is determining consumption and therefore determining savings, right? So income is fluctuating, but just like we had determinants of demand, we can also have determinants of consumption in the Keynesian model. Okay, so what other things other than the income, right? So remember, this fundamental relationship that we're graphing is consumption against income. So it's just like price and quantity back in the markets model. We say, right, but what else determines consumption? Okay, well, one of those things is wealth. So your income might be low, but your wealth might be high. What would you expect? Your consumption will still be high. Okay, so if your wealth goes up, your consumption goes up. Expected future price, expected future income. Just as we discussed back in the previous model, those will drive consumption up. What about debt? Well, if you already have a bunch of debt, you're likely to consume less. So if your household debt goes up, in fact, let's actually write that on here so that we can remember that. If our household debt goes up, our consumption will go down. Taxes is very obvious, right? Because if taxes go up, what must go down? Our disposable income. If our disposable income goes down, then it must be that our consumption goes down. Okay, so as a quick aside here, right, because we've talked a lot about consumption, we also obviously have this big driver that is investment, and it's empirically observed that investment is unstable over time, that it's unstable over time. Okay, so what's driving investment demand? If consumption is stable and investment is unstable, well, investment demand is going to be driven by the rate of return. So remember what we're thinking about. We got this model, there's aggregate expenditure, there's consumption, there's investment, there's government spending, there's exports, right? We want to think about how do we model these behaviors so that we can build this model of the macroeconomy. We said consumption is driven by income. What's investment driven by? Well, there's a really good answer to that, and that is the rate of return. What's going to drive how much investing I do? It's going to be how much return I'm going to get on my investment. Okay. What else determines investment demand? If that's sort of the fundamental relationship, just as we were talking about with consumption and income in this model, well, your expectation of returns would be one. So not just the rate of return you're getting, but the rate of return you could expect, right? Technological change that would change the productivity of my firm in the future. And of course, my capital goods that I currently have in the business, right? So rate of return and interest rates then fully determine investment in the short run. Once a level is established, investment is independent of income. That's going to be very important. It doesn't probably make a whole lot of sense to you in this moment. We're going to show you this when we get to the full model, okay? So what I'm saying is this is really the kicker. In fact, let's highlight that. This is really the kicker. Investment is independent of income the way that we have constructed this particular model. Okay, so let's do the simple Keynesian model. Right? So we have aggregate expenditure, and aggregate expenditure could equal all of these things, right? So our full model will have aggregate expenditure, consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. But we want to highlight two really important things in our simple Keynesian model, right? One is the relationship between aggregate expenditure and consumption, and then obviously the other is the relationship of aggregate expenditure and investment, which of course we must keep consumption in the model at the time. Okay, so I'm going to do something very straightforward. I'm going to say what's aggregate expenditure given consumption. What if we set everything else in the model equal to 0? So I'm just going to say pretend we live in a world where all that's happening in the model is consumption. There's no investment, there's no government, there's no exports, there's no imports. Okay, and then I'm going to add in investment to kind of give us proof of concept, and you'll see how that changes things in the model. So let's do it. Aggregate expenditure and income. What's that? That's consumption and income. What's this line? That's aggregate expenditure equal to consumption. So just as I was aggregate expenditure equal to income. That's just like what I was showing you earlier with consumption equal to income. So what is the principal lesson that we learned before? It is that we have consumption rising with income, but at a rate slower than income, right? So the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. That's what I'm saying, okay? So what does that make consumption look like? It makes it look like this. Why is that? There's some point here where consumption is equal to income, and if income goes up, we move rightward on the graph, consumption rises, but it rises by less than income, and so we begin to fall below the line. We fall further and further below the line. Our income goes up, our consumption doesn't keep up with it, right? And there's some point below this short-run equilibrium, right, where consumption is higher than income because we have that consumption smoothing idea that we had before in the class, okay? So what happens? Well, we can take this particular lesson. We can say this is point A here, right? And point A is in this short-run equilibrium point. And what do we know? We know that down here, where I'm graphing savings and investment against income, savings is 0, right? So there's that axis line. Why do I know that? Because here the two lines cross, and consumption is equal to income, so therefore savings must be 0. I spent all my money, so I can't have saved anything. If I'm to the left of it, right, then savings would be negative. If I'm to the right of it, then savings would be positive. But right here, savings is equal to 0 because consumption is equal to income. Okay, so there is our really basic model. Of course, this isn't very interesting. What happens if we then go to this point here and say there's some level of investment? There's some level of investment. Let's say that there is $100 in investment. That there's $100 in investment, right? There's $100 in investment. That must be coming from somewhere. And there must be pressures in the investment market that will then drive something that's happening in the savings market. Because remember, savings and investment must fundamentally be going together. Okay? How do we see that? How do we see that? Well, we would have a parallel. So I've drawn these exactly parallel. Why is that? Because this is that idea that investment is independent of income. So where now is our new equilibrium point? It's right here at point B. So what's true at point B? Well, when we come down here, savings is not 0. Savings is not 0. How do we know that? This is our line of consumption. This is consumption plus investment. The distance between these two is 100. So how do we see that down below? At 100, we have an investment line. We have an investment line. So there's investment equal to 100. There's investment equal to 100. Okay. So what's this gap between B and this little point here? Right. We'll call it C or whatever. That gap is also 100. That's the level of consumption. Notice, if you will, that C is actually slightly greater than A because we have this higher level of income. That's really the kicker to the Keynesian model, right? Is that we got this higher level of consumption, so we got this higher level of income, we got this investment involved in there, and so that's what's driving savings. So where savings must be here equal to 100, and so we get this line, we get this line that puts savings something like this. Let me see if I can get those lined up so that it's clear for everybody. Something like that, okay? So there's our savings line. There's our savings curve. Looks something like that. Okay, so let's add a few things here to hopefully sort of like clarify the model, right? I'm saying here's your initial level of income. There's your second level of income, right? That's also true. These are the same numbers right here, right? And then for clutter's sake, I'm not going to do this, right? But we can draw these lines over here and get our level of aggregate expenditure. Why, if we draw this line over from A, is the aggregate expenditure the same thing as consumption? Because the only thing in aggregate expenditure is consumption. If I draw this line over here, what goes over here, it's aggregate expenditure equal to consumption plus investment. This is an aggregate expenditure line, not just consumption. Okay, so the only thing that really tends to trip up us here when we're looking at this is thinking of these two things as totally separate. They're not, right? I'm saying, what if aggregate expenditure is just consumption? What if we have the same pattern of consumption, but we have this additional level of investment? So those two things end up being related. Okay, so let me make another quick note here for us. This distance here is that 100. Now, here's a real kicker out of the Keynesian model, right? The aggregate expenditure is above consumption by the $100. The eventual equilibrium actually occurs well above that in this next point, B, right? This is driven by our multiplier effect, okay? So multiplier effect is this idea that spending changes alter equilibrium income by spending changes times the multiplier. This is because one person's spending is another person's income, okay? So we have this additional $100 happening here. How is it that income went up because of that? That's because one person's spending is another person's income in the Keynesian model. All right, and there's a mathematical formula that we can show and we can derive for the purpose of this class. We're not going to do that, so you're just going to trust me on this one. In future macroeconomics classes, you'll get into working out all the math of this. The multiplier is equal to 1 divided by the marginal propensity to consume. 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So as the marginal propensity to consume goes up, the amount that 1 is divided by goes down, and so the multiplier goes up. Okay, so marginal propensity to consume going up makes our multiplier go up. Okay, so how do we see that? Well, look at this. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, then the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus 0.9. That, of course, is 0.1 there. 1 divided by 0.1 is 10. So if we have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9, our multiplier is equal to 10. That means every dollar spent in the economy actually leads to a total impact in the economy, in our spending changes, leads to a tenfold increase. So every dollar leads to $10 in income in the economy, and that's how we see that number being driven up in the Keynesian model. Okay, now, before I go on, and be remiss if I didn't talk about this, what number do we observe in reality? So is it a tenfold increase? Well, we see that we have this idea called injections, which I haven't really introduced yet in this class, but all the things that are on the right-hand side of GDP are what we call injections, and they're all equal to aggregate expenditure, right? So if we have increases in consumption, that multiplier effect might be really true, right? But we also have another way to do that, and that's government expenditure. So what Keynes ends up arguing is when we have a recession, we have slack in the economy, the government can come in and it can do some spending, and through that spending, we'll see increases in income in the economy due to the multiplier effect. So what is the government multiplier effect then? What is the observed government multiplier effect? So go ahead and pause the video now. Take a look at this. What do you think? Is it 0, 0.25, 1, 2, 4, 5, 10, or 20? Pause the video. Tell me what you think it is. So remember, 1 would be basically 0 multiplier effect. That's every dollar that we spend, we get $1 in income. 10 is that number that we talked about before. Every dollar that we spend, we get $10 in income. 0 would mean every time we spend $1, we actually get nothing out of it in the economy. Okay, the number that we observe and estimate in the United States for the government multiplier is 0.25. Every dollar that the government spends results in 0.25 in income in the economy. And they might be thinking, oh, that's not too bad, except that means if we didn't take that dollar out in government spending and put it, if we didn't take that dollar for government spending and we allowed it to be where it was, the economy would actually be further ahead by 75 cents for every dollar that we didn't spend. Okay? Why is this? This is due to an idea called crowd out. Government spending has to be funded. It has to be funded by taxes. We're actually going to talk about that more here in a moment with this model. But if you go and take taxes out of a relatively strong economy, you are pulling out money that could be otherwise spent. It could be going in here, and you're putting it in here. It's less efficiently done, so you actually lose economic activity. Now, some of you will say, but aren't there a case for the government to go about spending? The reason the observed multiplier is so bad is because government spending is really high when we are not in a depression. So the problem with government spending isn't so much the spending itself. It might be, but that's a different conversation. Isn't necessarily the spending itself. It is really when we are doing the spending. So if you're doing the spending when you're at short-run equilibrium, when you're doing the spending when the early growth model works, you're actually harming the economy because you're messing with those market mechanisms. If you're doing the spending in the deep parts of the depression, then Keynes's assumptions hold, and we wouldn't expect a multiplier to be below 1 at that point. Okay, this brings us to another idea we call the paradox of thrift. In the Keynesian model, we observe this real problem. When a consumer plans to save more money, they increase their savings, it actually decreases the amount that they save. And why is that? That's because if investment depends on income, the result becomes less saving. Remember we said earlier, investment can be independent of income. And this actually holds true even if that's not the case. And I'm going to show that here by showing investment being flat. So let me just make us a quick side note here because I don't want people to get confused. Paradox of thrift holds even if investment is independent of income. Okay, so just we want to make that really clear here. The classic Keynesian example shows this here, and that's why this is flat. Okay, so this idea here is why I've drawn that curve flat, so keep that in mind. So what happens if we are at some level of savings, we increase our savings to this higher level of savings? What happens? Well, because we're wanting to save more, it reduces consumption. We actually decrease our income, and the amount that we end up saving does not increase. So we decide to save more. So we say, okay, we're going to save more, but that lowers our income. So the amount that our savings is increased is offset by the loss in our income, and we actually end up saving the same amount. If investment, right, is sloped upward, is not independent of income, it'll actually decrease saving, not just cause it to be zero. Okay, let's combine. Okay, so here's the example that I was talking about. I forgot that I put this in here. If investment is positively increases, remember aggregate expenditure includes income. If I increase the amount that I save and then I shift backwards in income, I'll actually save less. My savings will go down. Paradox of thrift. Okay, let's combine all these things into the full Keynesian model. I've shown the Keynesian model, and so you'll recognize actually AE1C and AE2C plus I. Those are the exact ones from over here. So I've just replicated this. Now, for the sake of the brevity of this video and everything, I'm going to not take the time to like put all of these things on here. I'm just going to make a couple observations. Government spending and net exports in this observation are independent of the level of income. So when I add them in, it's the same mechanism, right? You get that increase there. It drives up income, and we fit along the savings curve. Why is that? Well, there's two important lessons, right? The important lessons here are that government taxation is paid for in part by savings. So our consumption increases by less than the amount that our income goes up, and the rest of the difference in taxation is paid for by savings, right? And we have this other idea that our exports is going to be driven by our level of savings. Okay, if this is a thing that confuses you, please reach out to me. I'm happy to write this full Keynesian model all the way out. It's just that once we understand the way that we add investment to the model, government spending and net exports are added to the model in the same manner. So if that's a thing that confuses you, reach out to me. I'll clip a little video of this up for you and send it along just so you can see that happening. But just don't be too intimidated by the way the final model looks. If you understand how we added investment, everything else is relatively straightforward. Okay, so a couple of points. One, the multiplier effect exists with all injections. Okay, so C plus I plus G plus X minus M. In practice, government spending multipliers below 1, so you get more crowd out for that than the multiplier, but C and I and net exports all have positives, right? As I said a minute ago, taxes have less than full impact on spending because households pay for taxes in part by reducing their savings, right? So that leads us to still have a positive multiplier effect with our injections. So the key idea, sort of the takeaway, if you will, from the Keynesian model is this idea that we can look at these two things and we can calculate a gap, right? So a recessionary gap is the necessary increase in aggregate expenditure to bring the economy back to full employment from a recessed state. So it's the GDP gap divided by the multiplier. So we're in a recession. How much does aggregate expenditure have to increase? If we need it to increase 400 and the multiplier is 4, then we only need an increase in aggregate expenditure of 100 because then income will increase by 400. Okay, the inflationary gap is if we're overheated, if we're above that equilibrium point actually, then we need a spending reduction necessary to bring an overheated economy back to full employment divided by the multiplier. So if we're overheated by 400, we need a decrease in spending by 100 if the multiplier is 4 to get us back down to equilibrium because we needed to reduce the aggregate expenditure by 400.